Okay, grab a sip of coffee, and we're going to go ahead and assemble the cuff parts. So we're going to attach the lining and interfacing section to the tapestry fabric. Putting right sides together, we're going to figure out which fabric has the most amount of slack and put that one on the outside. Then we're going to marry up each of the seams. And then we can spread out the slack from the tapestry fabric all along where it meets up the lining. The easiest way to do this is to put a pin halfway the distance of the remaining gap and then fill it in with pins in between each. And once I've completed one side, we'll go ahead and use the same technique to pin the other side, starting in the center. And unfortunately for all of my viewers, the free version of the video editor that I'm using only speeds things up twice as fast, which is why this is going so slow. I'm also unable right now to record new music tracks, so unfortunately we're stuck with some old stock music with a really terrible microphone. And if you couldn't tell, we've now moved indoors due to inclement weather. The next few videos have really poor lighting, and I apologize ahead of time. So if you've ever wanted to not have to use these small spools of thread and instead use the larger ones that are available, you don't actually need any special tools in order to get it to work with your sewing machine. It's really quite simple, and I might add that to a future video. Okay, so we didn't actually go over cutting out the interfacing or attaching the lining for the collar portion, so that's essentially what I did behind the scenes and don't have a recording of it. So what I've done is centered it on a remnant of the tapestry fabric that we had left over, and I'm not doing a standard 5/8 seam allowance. Instead, I'm using just what's necessary with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. It works because I made the collar pattern myself, and it keeps me from having to waste an excessive amount of fabric with as many collars as I make. Now, if you notice, obviously I didn't cut out the collar portion on the tapestry fabric. I just attached the already assembled lining and interfacing portions to the tapestry fabric, and I'm just using the interfacing as a guide for the shape of the collar, and I'll just go ahead and do one single cut to trim everything down. It is, of course, not necessary to remove the stage in order to do the cuff portion. It's always a possibility to use the inner side as the sewing surface. I just prefer this method in order to make my work a little easier to deal with. If you noticed, I put in a pin at my starting point. It's not technically necessary in this instance because I'm using black thread throughout most of the what will be invisible seams for this particular coat. If I were using a thread that was less noticeable, having that pin in there would be an indicator to me that I've come all the way around, and that's where I should start my back stitch. You'll also see me on both the cuff assemblies. I'm readjusting the pressed out seams before feeding them through the machine. Despite the fact that we press them out, they don't have a tendency to want to stay while they're being forced through two very tightly pressing pieces of metal. So to make sure that they lay flat, I'm going to make sure that they are situated before sending them through. So there are a couple of things to realize when it comes to actually feeding pins through your machine. And things that I just kind of learned along the way as my laziness prevented me from wanting to pull them. The first is the sharpness of the needle that you're using on your sewing machine. Be familiar with not only the size that you're using with the thickness of the fabric, but also how quickly it will dull depending on the type of fabric that you're using. This does actually play into what may or may not happen when your needle eventually will come to strike one of the pins. It's a fairly low probability, especially when you're working with a really forgiving type of fabric, like this really soft tapestry. The other factor that goes into whether or not your pins are likely to get hit by or your machine have an issue with the pins moving through is whether or not they're able to move when incidentally struck by the needle coming down. So the sharpness has an effect by whether or not it's going to pass between the needle and the fabric, but also whether or not the pin itself has a little bit of give within the fabric.